This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. It is still the nominations time for the podcastawards.com contest. If you could nominate the podcast in the religion and spirituality category, that would be fantastic. And next month we'll begin the voting. Again, I'm doing this not to do the beauty contest, but rather to expose the podcast to a wider audience. I want to thank my newest rater and reviewer, Reet. Thank you so much for rating the podcast on the Apple Podcast Store. Please consider rating and reviewing the podcast on the Apple Podcast Store or podchaser.com. And subscribe to the podcast wherever you are listening. Mike T is off this week. I did the editing, so you can blame me for all of the problems. Mike will be back in the saddle here shortly. On to today's show. My guest today is David. David is the son and grandson of pastors. He was a Southern Baptist and became a very hard Calvinist until he began to have doubts. As he dug into apologetics to try to answer the questions that he had and reread the Bible, things began to unravel. Today, David is the co-host of the That's Questionable podcast with two of his best friends, and they talk about the deep questions of Christianity in a safe way that they hope is approachable for doubters and people just coming out of Christianity. I think you're going to enjoy David's story. So without further ado, here is David. David, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Well, great. Thank you for having me.
So we will get into this in more detail, but you are the co-host of a new podcast called That's Questionable.
Yes.
I love the format of what you guys are doing, kind of just asking the questions and then bouncing off each other, where you're at on those questions about elements of Christianity and religion. And so again, we'll get into that in a little bit more detail, but I want to begin with what was your religious experience like? How was it for you growing up?
Yeah. So I grew up the grandson of a pastor and the son of a pastor. I was fully indoctrinated into the Southern Baptist, if you're familiar with that.
Yeah.
So not charismatic, kind of the frozen chosen,
Yeah.
very Calvinistic. I was raised in that, and I first went to church when I was 2 weeks old, and I was expected to be there every time the doors were open. I was very fortunate not to have a father that put pressure on me as far as how I was supposed to act, but I was a pretty good kid. I mean, I didn't really cause any problems. And, a lot of people grew up in a household where their dad's a pastor and their experience in the home was different than their experience in the church.
Sure.
So whenever they got home, their father became a different person. He was no longer the pastor, but they domineering and all that. My dad was not that way.
Okay.
He was kind, gentle. I didn't have any resentment towards the church because of my dad's role in the church.
Okay.
So I was very fortunate in that respect. So I grew up, went to a Baptist college, later, served as a deacon and elder, taught doctrine, taught new members classes. And it's kind of a joke on our podcast that I also got into apologetics. And
yeah,
I always try to work into our podcast at least once. Hey, you guys know I was a apologetics teacher, right? So it's kind of a joke.
Yes.
But to be honest with you, I started out with a class of about 40, and through a lot of hard work, got it down to about 8.
Yes.
So I wouldn't say I wasn't destined for greater things.
Okay. So you were actively involved, and it sounds like you had a really positive experience in the church as well, including with your dad. And I do like to point out, my goal is never to just shoot at Christians. I think most pastors are trying to give, and they're good people, and they're trying to be good to people, right? And it's just that sometimes evangelicalism itself can take that good impetus and twist it. So I'm glad to hear that you had a positive experience. But when did you begin to have some questions then?
So, the reason why I got into apologetics was because I had questions. And so, as a lot of us do, I became more fanatical than my parents did. So my parents were in no way fundamentalist. I became more of a fundamentalist Christian, where I started going to a non-denominational church, and then just had some issues with the pastor there, and I thought it was me.
Okay.
I was the problem because the pastor was the anointed. That's kind of the way they talked.
Right.
Until something happened within my family, and we had a conflict. My wife was on staff at the church and was good friends with the pastor. And then we had a conflict, and I saw the other side of the pastor. He turned on us. And, and so I don't want to get into the details other than
sure.
I began to look at that and say, gosh, man, and as he's doing this, he is preaching on each Sunday. He was doing a different sermon on the fruit of the Spirit. So he was taking love, joy, kindness, gentleness, patience, all of that. And he used us as an example in one of his sermons, not our names, but he used, everybody would know, all of our friends would know who they were talking about. So just a manipulator.
Yeah.
So we left the church and tried to find another church home. But whenever you're around that, it's tough to go back into church, because there's just, when you see behind the veil of a church like that, it's just tough. And so what ended up happening is I started digging in more to apologetics.
Okay.
And really trying to figure out, hey, what is this all about? Why is he so different than what he preaches? And trying to really go through my Bible and study my Bible really, and just, I wanted to be the best person I could be. Right. And the best Christian I could be. And, how could I change things? Because that's kind of the way I'm wired. And I started, this was probably the first shoot a fall. Is that an expression? Anyway, the first thing that really happened was I started reading Bart Ehrman.
Oh no.
Well, when I taught apologetics, I didn't actually read Bart Ehrman. I read what other apologetics said about Bart Ehrman.
Right.
And so I'm like, I got to go to the original source here. And he said he asked his class, when he taught his New Testament class in North Carolina, to read the Gospels horizontally. Mm-hmm. And that was new for me.
Okay.
And so I started doing that. And again, the way I'm wired, I did it on a spreadsheet. So I went really and recorded the story in each, like the story of the birth of Christ. I did it in each gospel. And really, of course, there's only really two that really talk about that, but I noticed the differences between the two.
Yeah.
And, we tend to take the story of Jesus and kind of lump everything together. But when you actually look at those as separate writings, you realize there is some tough things that I was unable to really reconcile. Right. And I was talking to a friend of mine who actually does a lot of apologetics as well. And they told me that, well, hey, none of that is doctrine though. It doesn't change doctrine.
Okay.
And my response, I hadn't even really thought about this. I was like, well, then why do we have such a conflict between churches and between pastors and writers of just the basic salvation? How are we saved? Is it more Calvinist, where it's God's sovereignty and all that, or is it more free will? And there's verses to support each.
Right.
So I think that's not a logical thing to say. And then the other side of that is if you can disprove that this is accurate, what's to say that everything else isn't? I mean, how do we know what's accurate and not? Because we don't have originals, and we only have copies of copies of copies. You heard probably Bart Ehrman talk about that.
Where do you stop? Where do you stop the criticism?
Yeah, well, I can tell you this much. I didn't finish the spreadsheet.
Right.
So I got to certain points of it, and I kind of did the major stories first. And when I got to, and I was going to go back and hit some of the other stories. When I got to the ascension of Christ,
Yeah.
in Luke, they weren't supposed to leave Jerusalem, and then, in Matthew, he's at the Sea of Galilee, and he ascends from there, in Matthew, and he ascends from Jerusalem. And so it just doesn't make any sense to me now, looking back on it. And then I just started listening to a lot of podcasts. So I listened to Everyone's Agnostic, which Cass, but we live pretty close to each other.
Oh, okay.
I didn't know him before that, but I reached out to him and had lunch with him and Dave Warnock, who's good friends with Kat, if you know Dave.
Dave's been on the podcast.
Yeah.
I adore Cass and what he's done.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and I was a guest, my wife and I were guests on that.
Okay.
On his podcast. I was one of his last podcasts. And so it seems like, either I'm reducing the size of a class or I'm closing out a podcast. So I'm sorry, this may be your last episode.
Yeah, I think we're going to wrap this baby up now.
Yeah, pretty quick. But no, they've become friends. And and so then I started listening to Dogma Debate, and that really shook me up. But it was one specific episode of The Thinking Atheist that did it for me. He did an episode, and I think this was end of 2018, where he had one called The Silent Witness, and he was talking about the BTK killer and how God was in the room when those things happened. And I began to ask myself, and this is one of the things that Seth asked, was, if you were in the room, would you stop it? If you had all the power to stop what was going on, wouldn't you stop it? And that's when I knew.
Okay.
And from that moment forward, I knew that I was not a Christian, because it's just the realization that God can't be all powerful, omnipresent, and all loving at the same time. I think that's and there's a word for that, theophany or something like that. I can't remember exactly what the word is for that, but yeah, that's really, and I've had a lot of pastor friends and apologetics friends that have tried to talk me kind of back into the church, and you can't unknow what you know.
Yeah. I don't know if you've listened to this podcast much at all, but I mean, I talk about a lot that apologetics actually had the opposite effect on me. I'm curious, do you feel that your deep dive into apologetics helped extend your faith, or was it the beginning of the end for you?
I think it was a long, drawn out death. So, I have listened to a lot. You are on my rotation of every time you have an episode come out, I'm listening to it. Yeah. And I love it. And that's why I reached out to you, was just simply because I like the way you talk to people. And I like the way you really are graceful and very understanding and kind. And I like that. I've listened to other podcasts that it gets pretty nasty on it, and that's just not my style. I don't like it. But I was trying to confirm my questions, trying to confirm my beliefs when I got into apologetics. Studied a lot of Dr. William Lane Craig and Case for Christ and Dan Wallace and Daniel Wallace and all these different guys, and there were certain questions that would come up. I would have a friend that my daughter was actually going to a Christian school, and I had a friend that was kind of helping out there, trying to teach some things, and he talked to the school about teaching something other than young Earth creationism, and we had dialogue with several people there, and I dug in more on apologetics, because I'm like, you can't really think the Earth is 7,000 years old. Surely not.
Yes.
And I would have discussions with friends, and I said, yeah, but it has the appearance of being old, and it just never sat well with me, because we're supposed to look at creation and know as evidence for God, and yet when we look at creation, it's not what it appears to be. And so that just was a logical problem for me. But yeah, I started in that to try to prove my faith, and I ended up losing my faith through it eventually.
I believe you guys did an episode on does Christianity need apologetics? And one of the things I thought you guys nailed really well is kind of what you've just described there. Rather than looking at the evidence of, geology and, the earth itself and trying to determine the age from that, apologetics tends to say, we think this thing is true. And now how can we find evidence for that? It's that difference of going from the evidence to some theory or from some theory to some evidence that makes a huge difference.
Yeah, there's definitely a confirmation bias there when you're, and I had that. So I completely understand that.
Me too, for sure.
Yeah. And it's almost like, Patty Hearst, that Stockholm syndrome that you just believe. I mean, it's you just believe. The problem is when you stop believing, you can't get it back. So yes. once I really saw the issues with that, it just unravels. I had people tell me, God, just quit studying that stuff. I'm like, I'm not supposed to dig in. Well, just read your Bible. Well, that's what I'm doing. And anyway, that's the way my mind works. I'm a skeptic by nature. And as a Christian, I thought God wired me that way. And so I just couldn't shut it off.
I wish that more people would do what you did, right? Read the Gospels in parallel like that. And you pretend you're a journalist, who, what, when, where, and why, and answer those questions for the birth of Christ, for the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. And you come up with wildly different answers to those given each gospel story. It also reminds me, you mentioned how people will kind of wave you off and say, well, that's not doctrine, that part's not important. There's a current focus on mere Christianity and basically acknowledging, yeah, we have disagreements here and there between denominations or faith traditions or that kind of thing, but really it's only about the core things. But then what do you decide? How do you decide what are the core things? And as you were pointing out, even in the Gospels, there are some disagreements there. So how do you resolve all those problems?
Right. There's a pastor I listened to a lot back when I was in the height of my zealotness for Christianity, and he made the statement that what you take figuratively and what you take literally in the Bible, what you take figuratively, what you can take figuratively. I'm sorry, you take literally what you can take literal, and everything else you take. Well, where is that line at?
Yeah. So
am I literally supposed to think that all the animals got on a boat?
Right.
Well, he would say, do I literally think that a man spent 3 days in a fish, in the belly of a fish? And so there's a real disconnect there as far as what you can take literally, and there's a lot of arguments over that.
Yeah.
Now, it seems like that if an all-knowing God was to write or inspire the writing of the most important book ever in the history of mankind, it would have been something that would have been preserved to where we could look at the originals.
Right.
And it would have been something that was consistent. And I don't see that.
Right. I'd like to talk just for a minute about Calvinism. Again, if you've listened to the podcast, you hear me say this often, that people who take Christianity really seriously often wind up in one of the categories of either very charismatic, kind of moralistic, more of a fundamentalism, or Calvinism, Reformed theology. And I want to ask you to think back to your former self, the believing self. What was it about the idea of the sovereignty of God and being chosen that was appealing to you at the time?
Oh man, it's a select group. I've been chosen before the foundations of the world. I'm one of the, like a Marine, man. I'm one of the few and the proud. And I think just that thought that God loved me so much that not only did he choose me to be saved, but he also chose me to never lose my faith.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that preservation of the or is it perseverance or preservation of the saints?
Perseverance of the saints.
Yeah, in Tulip. Where that broke down for me eventually was the L. It's that limited atonement.
Yeah.
And when you start thinking about that logically, and I'm a slow thinker, it takes me a while to kind of figure these things out. But then you're at the point where Jesus didn't die for everyone. You couldn't go out and witness and say Jesus died for your sins. Well, I wouldn't know if he died for their sins or not, because if they were chosen, they were chosen. If not.
Yeah.
That didn't seem like, again, like a really loving God.
I have talked about, I had a theology professor who was a Reformed theologian in a very Arminian denomination. So Arminian being the focus on human choice in the salvation process. But what I found really attractive about it was this idea of the sovereignty of God, that God was in total control. But it isn't until you start to ask yourself the questions that you're describing of, well, what is the implication of that?
Oh, yeah.
What else does that mean, that it starts to kind of tear itself down? It becomes logically inconsistent.
Yes. And the issue I had is I couldn't go all the way the other way either. And so, because then you're thinking in terms that if I could lose my salvation, then Christ's sacrifice on the cross was not enough.
Right.
And so I ended up landing in the middle in Molinism. So, which is really where God knows what you're going to do, and he would call those he knows will accept. And so somebody that may never accept God, he might put them in a place in the world, like in the Andes, where they would never hear the message and be more likely to be saved because they never hear the message of God. And so the worst thing you can do there is be a missionary. Yeah. So anyway, all of it kind of unravels at some point, but that's where I ended up. Was there was a movie several years ago called Sliding Doors. I don't know if you ever saw that movie.
Yes, I did.
Yeah, I think it was Gwyneth Paltrow was in it, but there was a split in her timeline where she made one decision to do this, one decision to do that, and her whole life changed.
Right.
In each timeline based on that one decision. And so it's just that, in Molinism, that's really what it is. God knows at some point you're going to be, at that place you accept. And if you're not, he'll put you someplace where you won't ever have to make that decision.
So if you have a community of Reformed believers, have you been told that you were never really a Christian? If you are no longer a Christian now?
The first thing they say. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. That you were never really saved. And the problem with that is when you're, I didn't want to lose my salvation. Even though I was investigating that, I really thought I would read Bart Ehrman and realize the problems with his logic.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what I thought, because I thought, the word is true. And it's just one of those things that when you're deconverting, like I did, I was weeping before the Lord, asking him to give that belief back to me. And he didn't. And so then I was like, I'd have people tell you need to repent and to pray more. And I was already praying and fasting and doing all those things I've been taught to do.
Yeah.
And still there's that disconnect. Well, if that's what Christianity is, that's cruel. And so it's amazing how much more peace I feel on this side of the decision than on the other side.
I say it all the time. It is very much a born again like experience. The scales fall from your eyes, literally.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. It's a little scary. It took me a while to let go of the concept of hell.
Okay.
That was big. That was big for me, because what if I'm wrong? What if I'm wrong? My whole family basically deconverted at the same time.
Oh, really?
So,
okay.
Yeah. Yeah. We were really on the same path. I think I had one daughter that really didn't. I don't know if she really actually believed. I think she just kind of went along with it, because, and I think she wanted to believe.
Right.
But she just couldn't. She's more of a skeptic like I am. but I don't know. I'm very fortunate in that respect because I know marriages have broken up over that. And so we have all really walked down that path, to the point I've had people saying, well, you're leading your whole family to hell.
Oof.
Okay. Well, I don't believe in hell. So I feel okay.
So I'm curious then, with your wife and yourself, like who said the first thing? Like I'm having doubts. Who expressed that first?
I did. Yeah, I did. We had both been struggling and had just hours and hours of conversations about what had happened at the church. Because we were, not only did we lost every friend we had at the church.
Mm.
And so people, and they were out there telling rumors about us. And so that was heartbreaking. And so we had a lot of discussions about that, about how we were both kind of, we tried some other churches. I have a good friend who is a pastor of a church, and he's not after power or money or fame. He's just a sweet man who wants to help people and love on people.
Yeah.
And he certainly isn't getting rich doing it, but we just didn't feel right in his church either. And it wasn't anything against the church. It was just, we were so scarred.
Yeah.
And then one day, kind of off the cuff, I said, I'm listening to this podcast and I hate to even tell you what I'm listening to. And she said, well, what is it? And I said, well, I just listened to this episode of The Thinking Atheist. And she's like, well, I'd like to, I've been having some questions myself. I'd like to listen to that. And all of a sudden, a couple of days later, I get this, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
I never thought of it like that.
Right. Right. That is interesting. I don't think I've had a lot of people say that happens simultaneously. So that's great.
Yeah. And now we've really been together on the whole journey. I mean, like you take Dave Warnock, that ended up costing him his marriage.
Right.
Was him leaving the faith. And
yeah.
She's the most important person in the world to me. So I feel very fortunate that, I've got to say blessed, but that's probably not the right word.
I'm all about reinterpreting the religious words, so I get
Yeah,
you.
Exactly.
The other thing I wanted to comment on is I have this blog post about the deconversion process, and you really expressed it well, of the kind of deafening silence, as you are saying, God, do something. I need you to do something to keep me. And then that impetus to double down. You're describing fasting and praying and reading the scriptures more. And in some ways, that's the end game, right? When you are in desperation, doing all the right things, it is that silence that will get you in the end.
Yes. So I went to the extreme of taking my Bible and taking a purple crayon highlighter and going through and marking every place where it referred to God, different names for God and all that. And that was probably a mistake as well.
Okay.
I did the New Testament first, and I went to the Old Testament. I started going through the law and verses on slavery, you can beat your slave, and the verses on rape. And I was like, God, this is not what I thought it. And I had read the Bible through, but for whatever reason, I had more skeptical eyes. And that's what led me to really, if this doesn't really make sense, then maybe I should read Bart Ehrman, and maybe that would make more sense, or maybe that would trigger something in me. But anyway, it's a very lonely feeling.
Yeah.
That the God that you have spent your entire life thinking that he is in control, and there's a reward for you after going through this life. And you're told your whole life through the scripture. My parents never said this to me, but charismatic pastors have told, the pastor I was with said this to me, that not only are you a sinner, but you don't deserve anything. I mean, you're weak.
Right.
And so not only am I sit there just praying to God, but I'm also knowing how weak I am in the process, that it's all up to him. Really, I want to believe. But then it gets to the point where, well, he must not want me. I mean, he must not want me to be in his kingdom if he's not willing to answer me.
Wow. One more theology thing. I also heard you mention that the Trinity played a part when you were trying to teach the Trinity, and that you started to question at that point as well.
Yeah, and that was a part of the new members class and a part of the apologetics class. But whenever I taught that, I just hope people didn't ask many questions.
Yes.
Because it's very, it's very confusing. And I've done a lot of research into Mormonism because I had encounters with missionaries, and being somebody that studied apologetics, I wanted to know how to interact with them.
Right.
And now I look back on it, I think they may have had a better answer for who they believe in three gods. And I'm like, well, maybe that is the way to look at it. Or there's just one God that takes different shape, which is a heresy according to Orthodox Christianity.
Right.
But the three is one, and Shamrock, whatever you want to use to explain it, just logically doesn't make sense, to the point where you have pastors saying, hey, if we could understand God, he wouldn't be God. Well, that's a bumper sticker.
Right.
That's not, that doesn't really help. It may soothe your concern for a little bit, but it's not really gonna, if you really are searching for answers, that's not really gonna help a whole lot.
Yeah, it has no explanatory power.
Yeah.
You're telling my story. So many elements are very similar, right? But I read through the Bible, a few years before my deconversion, and I really did notice the Trinity does not fall out of the scriptures, right? That is absolutely a post hoc rationalization to try to not be a polytheist, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a human construct because they try to explain the different references in the New Testament as far as, I'll send you a helper, and how can Jesus be God? But most Christians don't understand that, because they use, when they pray, they use Jesus and God really simultaneously.
Right.
And the entity, the person that's actually here active in our world is the Holy Spirit, and most people don't pray to the Holy Spirit. It's just illogical. And maybe my human brain just won't understand that, because I can't understand how, the Grand Canyon could be 7,000 years old. So I probably don't understand a lot,
Right.
Logic doesn't always work. So
yeah. So let's talk about the podcast. So you and two of your friends, the title of the podcast is That's Questionable. Mm-hmm. And again, I really love the premise.
Appreciate that.
You're not attacking things. You're just saying, maybe we should think about this more.
Yeah.
Tell me how that came about.
So Jim and Nathan are my two best friends, and we've been best friends for years. Jim lives close enough for me. I'm in the Nashville area. I can walk to his house.
Okay.
And Nathan works close enough to me where I can walk to his office. And so we're just connected. Like tonight, Jim and his wife and myself and Amy are going after dinner together and just spending some time together. They've been out of town, so we're catching up. We've had so many conversations on Nathan's back deck about these things. And we just decided, well, hey, if we're going to talk about it, let's at least let other people hear what we're talking about. And we are rookies. I mean, we don't even really edit what we do. But I'll tell you, we wanted to find a space. And this is one of the things I really appreciate about your podcast is we wanted to find a space where people that are questioning their faith can come into, and it's safe from a standpoint of language and references, because that was the big shock when I came out of the faith. Was I listened to a lot of atheist broadcasts, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. I have nothing wrong with it, but some of those turned me off, just because my ears were not used to that. And so we just wanted a place where somebody could play it with their kids in the car. That, that's kind of our standard is, hey, can you can have it on and not worried about your kids hearing something that you don't want them to hear.
Right.
And we have a great setup. We go down to Nathan's place, and he's built this place behind his house that he operates a different business out of, but we just record right there. And,
cool.
And sometimes we'll get there and like when the NBA playoffs were on, we'd get there and we're like, let's watch the game instead. So sometimes they come out kind of sporadically. We're going to try to get on a weekly or a every other week release, because we're busy people. But it was really birthed out of that, and just trying to have a safe place, because we're kind of everyday guys. And so we feel like people that are questioning their faith have a lot of the same questions that we have.
Yeah.
And so, and we try to take a topic at a time, and we're going to, our next topic is going to be cancel culture, and what does that mean? And we try to be as topical as we can in certain respects. We do go back to the well a lot on certain things, especially when it comes to church leaders. But the number one, now I'm talking to people that are questioning their faith, and one of the number one things they talk about is the way that church leaders act, the way they have been, they've just gone all in for Trump. And a lot of Christians look at that. I know some of the far right-wing Christians will say, well, I like what Trump's doing. It's all about the judges or whatever their excuse is. But a lot of people look at that and they think, my pastor's supporting a man who's just vile. I wouldn't, how can you support him? So I think Trump is really, it's strengthened the more extreme parts of Christianity, but especially with younger people, they're leaving the faith because of him.
Right.
Because of the evangelicals' refusal to really call him out. And so we're just trying to be kind of a landing pad for people when they're questioning their faith. So they may come out and listen to us for 10, 15 episodes, and then decide to listen to Dogma Debate or some other things that maybe get into some different issues. And we're okay with that too. We just want to be a place, kind of a safe place for people to go.
And I can plus one that in that, when I was listening to it, I wasn't 100% sure that you were all deconverted. You're being so gentle.
Yeah. And that's something we've actually talked about. And if you were to go listen to the whole catalog, there's certain times I've come out and just said flat out, hey, I'm agnostic. I don't have answers for the creation of the universe. I don't know that anybody really does 100%. And maybe people do, but I don't know what those answers are. So I think it's very logical for me to just say, hey, I don't know.
Yeah.
But the freedom that opens to me to study different things. Like when I was really into Christianity, I would never go take a yoga class.
Right.
Because of what that represented. And if I take a yoga class on Sunday, I feel better off coming out of yoga class than I ever did coming out of church. And so it does take a little bit to understand kind of where we sit. But I would say that Nathan and I don't want to speak to Nathan, we're kind of a little bit farther on the agnosticism side. Jim, the big complaint about Jim that I have is he doesn't talk enough on the episode. He's so kind, and he wants us to have our input, but he's so kind, and he's very wise. He's just one of these guys that when I was deconverting, we all actually went to the same church. So Jim was a pastor at the church that I deconverted. He deconverted way before, or not deconverted, but left the church and really left organized religion way before I did. Nathan left at the same time. I was the straggler that was there with my fingernails clawing in the dirt, trying to stay in. But it's given us a different perspective there. But I've really gone a lot farther than Jim as far as heading towards agnosticism.
Okay.
Jim's deal is just about love. We should care and love about other people, which I maintain is more of a humanistic type approach. But I think we all recognize that we don't have all the answers. We also recognize that other people don't either.
Absolutely. And I think that the great irony for me is two drivers for me was about honesty and humility for, what drew me to Christianity. And then it's those two things that drove me out, right? I feel like, what you just said, I don't know, is the honest and humble answer to a vast array of questions.
Oh, yeah.
And that people are just unwilling to acknowledge that.
Yeah, it really is interesting that they're called to be humble, and yet they have all the answers.
Right.
And every other religion is wrong. and the freedom I have. You always heard there's freedom in Christ. I heard that freedom to be in Christ is just amazing. I feel so much more free now that I can research anything. I've looked into everything from Eastern religions to I've even looked into what if there is reincarnation? What if there is that? And I've read fairly recently the books by the guys at the University of Virginia that have studied a lot of that and done case studies on it, and it's really interesting stuff. I don't know that I believe it, but right. I believe there's as much evidence as that as for the Bible. Now I feel like the freedom to study anything.
Yeah. And I think freedom's a good word for that, right? You don't feel restricted into what you can explore, even if you are doubtful at the get-go, right? But you can still go search it, and it's not going to hurt you in the way that, as you mentioned, as a Christian, even yoga would be dangerous. In some way.
You're worshiping other deities. And I was taught that. And I've never experienced that. I've experienced, a lot of pain doing it. Just a good kind of pain, but it's just a freedom to do that and to realize that there is something within us. There is, and that's where I kind of conflict a little bit too with being atheist. Is I do believe there's more than this life. I just don't know what it is.
Okay,
and that's okay. And I may end up thinking, hey, we're just animals. We're just flesh and bones, and we die, we die. But to me, it just seems like there's more. There's an energy, there's something there that maybe it's not like the biblical sense that we're going to go to paradise, for the rest of eternity. But, maybe there is some kind of reincarnation, or maybe there is, I don't know, but it's so fun to not know.
Yes. And to research and to explore. Yeah.
And I don't have to carry that burden of answering for a faith that is very confusing. It's not the simple faith that Christians say it is. I think that's kind of a marketing kind of deal, kind of a bait and switch. You get into it and there's all this other stuff that comes along with it.
Right.
You get a whole set of new friends that you realize you don't even really want.
Yes. You've mentioned a few things, but now on this side of agnosticism, what do you find meaningful? What are the sources that feed you, as it were?
Yeah, I've taken up different hobbies. I usually try to do a lot of that on Sundays.
Okay.
Because that's really has always been the day that I slow down. And so I'm learning guitar. I'm doing a lot of photography and things like that, just trying to enrich my life in other ways, as opposed to praying that things will be better in my life or God will gift me in different ways. So that's really what I'm doing right now with my time and where I'm trying to grow personally.
Okay.
And we're empty nesters now. So I'm trying to spend extra time with my wife and just enjoying being together and enjoying nature and this beautiful world that came from somewhere. So yeah, it's just a totally different mindset, but it's very encouraging to, I guess I've been away from it for, a little over 2 years now.
Okay.
And I'm happier than I ever was in Christianity. And that's really what charges my batteries, just, seeing the world and learning new things.
Yeah.
I mean, not that I couldn't have learned guitar or photography or anything as a Christian, but there was never time for that. That time could be used for greater things. And so.
Or you might feel guilty. Like if you do, you're doing something that you just find pleasurable, like learning a guitar, you might feel guilty about it.
Yeah. And I took guitar a couple of years ago, and the guy was teaching me, was active in our church and was on the worship team and all that kind of stuff. And I had probably played, I don't know, I'd been working on it for a couple of weeks and starting to learn chords. And he said, okay, are you ready to go in and start playing for the infant care? That's what he said. And I'm like, but no, I'm just trying to learn something.
Yeah.
Well, you got to use it for God's glory. I'm like,
yeah.
No. This is mine. It's not his, it's mine.
Exactly.
if he wanted it to, if I was supposed to use that for God's glory, he would have given me some measure of talent. One thing I know is I don't have that. And that's the funny thing is literally in the gear shed that we are with that Nathan has, there are guitars on the walls. He's a guitarist and he's great. And here I am. I'll pick up a guitar and know 3 chords or whatever, but it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I always say I play the guitar poorly.
Yeah. I've got some goals. I've got some goals as far as I want to be able to play, a couple songs and that kind of stuff, and it's just a lot of fun. And
yeah,
and photography has been a passion for mine for a while. So I'm taking a trip in a couple of weeks and just going to DC and taking pictures, and I've got them framed on my wall at home and in my office. And
that's awesome.
Yeah, it's good. Life is good.
Well, David, thank you for being on the podcast, but I do want to give you an opportunity to tell people how they can find your podcast, That's Questionable.
Yeah, so they can do a search of That's Questionable on any of the platforms. I know we're on iTunes, Google, Spotify. We have a Instagram group and a Facebook group, and I couldn't tell you how to get there. So
if you email them to me, I'll put them in the show notes.
Yeah, I'll get Jim to help me with that.
Okay.
Because he's the guy that does all that. But we give all that at the end of the podcast. We give all that out. But I'll get that over to you so you can put them in the show notes.
Right.
But yeah, we would love for people to listen to us, and we're probably going to tweak the format a little bit and start including some other people, some guests, and just letting people tell their story, kind of similar to you, but more on what questions did you have, and kind of keeping with that theme of That's Questionable.
Right.
So anyway, that's probably where we're heading. I think people are going to get eventually tired of us talking to each other. So we have a lot of fun though.
Yeah. It's amazing though, like just having good conversation, like people are engaged with that. So I think it's good.
Yeah. And we'll tell each other who would want to listen to this. And yet I listen every day to people talk like your podcast, and I love it.
Yeah.
And so it's like, well, people do want to listen to it because they have similar questions and concerns. And it's a great way to get your mind going and really start thinking through things. So
David, thank you again for being on the podcast. I love your story. There were so many points of similarity with mine. So thank you so much.
Yeah. And thank you so much for having me on, and thank you for the work that you do. You're doing a great thing of letting people get on here and tell their stories. And I do appreciate it.
Final thoughts on the episode. Man, I really love the way David described doing the parallel look at the Gospels. I just highly recommend that for anyone who is serious about their faith. Read the Gospels side by side. Like I said, pretend you're a journalist. Who, what, when, where, and why for all the questions on the big stories, all of the common stories, the birth of Christ, the feeding of the 5,000. What are the 12 disciples' names? The crucifixion and resurrection, the ascension. At each of those stages, why are the details different? Now, every apologist is going to have an explanation for this, but does that satisfy you is the question. It didn't satisfy David. And I am not surprised to hear that as he dug deeper and deeper into apologetics, including teaching classes on apologetics, teaching about the Trinity, that the questions just began to mount. Instead of answering our doubts, apologetics just makes the doubts deeper and the questions more striking. The other thing I really appreciate is David really expressing that he did not leave because he wanted to. He left clawing, kicking, and screaming because he could do no other. So many apologists want to say you were never a real Christian. They want to say that you wanted to sin, that you wanted to leave out of rebellion. But those of us who have gone through this process, we know ourselves. We know that that wasn't our motivations. That if it were true, we would still believe it. But it isn't, and therefore we don't. And we left not of our own volition in many cases, including David's. I really appreciate David and his co-hosts on That's Questionable. What they are trying to do is be a safe landing place for people coming out of Christianity to speak that language, as well as acknowledging the questions that they have and questions that others may have as well. I think that's fantastic. I definitely recommend that you take a listen to that, and we'll have links in the show notes for sure. I want to thank David for being on the podcast, for sharing his story, for being open with us. The Secular Grace thought of the week is that doubt is a good thing. Doubt implies that you have skin in the game, that you care. I am a doubter. I care. I want to know what the truth is. Like David, I really appreciate doubt itself. I think doubt leads to questions, and questions leads to searching, and searching leads to answers. So I encourage you, the listener, no matter where you are with faith or out of faith, to search, to question, to trust but validate. And that doubt and that need for the truth, honesty and humility are the foundations of secular grace. It's what led me into Christianity. It's what led me out. All of those traits are human traits, and there is no need for a supernatural element to seek the truth, to be humble, and to be honest. I'm going to link to, yet again, my deconversion how-to article that talks about what David talked about, that impetus to double down, that reaching out to God, that wanting desperately to hear from God, and yet that not happening, and the steps that we often take on our way out. I want to encourage you that if you read that and you find that you don't fit what is described there, to feed back to me. Let me know what else needs to be in that document. How can we make it more general and apply for more people? We have several very interesting conversations coming up. I have Jeffrey, who wrote a book about being inside the Jehovah's Witnesses. He says that he's physically in but mentally out. That's coming up. And until then, my name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. Time for the footnotes. The beat is called Waves from Mackay Beats. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can promote it on your social media. You can subscribe to it in your favorite podcast application, and you can rate and review it on podchaser.com. You can also support the podcast by clicking on the affiliate links for books on gracefulatheist.com. If you have podcast production experience and you would like to participate with the podcast, please get in touch with me. Have you gone through a faith transition and do you need to tell your story? Reach out. If you are a creator or work in the deconstruction, deconversion, or secular humanism spaces and would like to be on the podcast, just ask. If you'd like to financially support the podcast, there's links in the show notes. To find me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, you can Google deconversion, you can Google secular grace, you can send me an email, gracefulatheist@gmail.com, or you can check out the website, gracefulatheist.com. My name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.